one of the moments in which you know you are under a high inflation is that you don't look into yearly rates anymore. It's month by month. Once they get their wage paid, you go right next to the supermarket because cash is like ice cubes, they're melting. It's like a daily war in which everybody plays against each other in order to be in front. We had reserves in gold, but I was always lending this gold to have some return on those reserves. In the Brazilian context, there was a time gold was a defense from high inflation alongside with the black market for dollars.
Hello, everybody. My name is Paul Buitink, and welcome to the Reinvent Money podcast, a podcast about money and power. Hyperinflation is a destructive force which far too many people have had to endure. Today, I'm going to better understand what hyperinflation is and how it can be killed, with none other than former governor of the Central Bank of Brazil, someone who has slain the hyperinflation monster in the 1990s in Brazil, Gustavo Franco. Hi, Gustavo. Welcome.
Hi, Paul. Good to be with you.
Yeah, such a great pleasure that you've accepted my invitation. We bumped into each other at the Warwick Economics Summit last month in Britain, and your story and life has fascinated me ever since. And so I'm really excited that we're going to talk about the things that you've experienced as a central bank governor and how you dealt with the hyperinflation in Brazil. But maybe some go back first a bit to your background. Like some kids, they want to become a firefighter. Did you already want to become a central banker when you were still in elementary school? Or?
Well, not really, but it was one thing after the other. Like everybody in my generation, I was, as an economist student, challenged by inflation, this being the big generational challenge of the day. And then I made that choice of this topic, extreme cases, to see whether such cases would help us deal with the not so extreme cases as we thought at the time. And then I found out that the so-called extreme cases, the hyperinflations, were more similar to Brazil, to what Brazil was living. And my idea of what was extreme was not so extreme. It's more common than I thought it was. And then the lessons were very valuable. Lessons of, there are not so many cases in history. We're talking about like 20 or 30 cases in every region of the world in the last 50 years, something like that, last century. And it's also difficult to define the threshold of high, super high, ultra high, hyperinflation. It's since the first study, it was, I guess, Philip Kagan's 1956 study on hyperinflations, that we've been adopting his definition of hyperinflation first as an episode that starts when inflation hits 50% per month, right? It's a huge number. It should be something over 10,000% per year, 12,000, 50% per month, okay? But then in practice, what happens with 10% per month, which is a lot, is not that different from what happens with 50%. And that has been noted by a number of other researchers questioning this definition of hyperinflation. And then Kagan himself was invited to write the hyperinflation entry in the Palgrave Dictionary of Economics. It's a good moment to to think about. It was like in the 90s at some point. And then Kagan himself said, well, there's no threshold really. Hyperinflation is just very high. Okay, that makes it vague but simpler in ways. But the one lesson, and I'm talking too much, one lesson to that discussion about the definition relates to diagnosing hyperinflation, which is very much a political issue. Each case is different. And the definition would be hyperinflation is that level of inflation in which there is an unconditional surrender to rehab, right? Imagine the addicted. There's a point he has to recognize he's sick and has to go into rehab.
Yeah.
That's hyperinflation.
Yeah.
For politicians in Brazil, there's this curious denial about hyperinflation, and I remember politicians telling me, "Do not use that word, okay? You're going to scare people unnecessarily."
Exactly, yeah, because in my view, hyperinflation is when people actually lose faith in the currency. So high inflation, people could still have faith in the currency, but it's just annoying that every year, for example, everything becomes 5 to 10% more expensive. But with hyperinflation, people just want to get rid of the currency. It's just they don't trust it anymore. And then I get the wheelbarrow images in mind of Weimar Republic. But he said also a fair definition that people with hyperinflation, people actually lose trust in their own currency and want to get rid of it the moment they lay their hands on it.
Well, all this is true, but there's infinite shades of gray in the very high inflation region. You lose faith in currency with 10% per month, 5% per month, or 50% per month. It's not clear, right? Somewhere in that way, that moment happens, the moment in which there's a I don't know, a click, something happens, and politicians say that's too much. Society says it's too much, and then something is done. The rehab thing starts.
Yeah.
Each country in a different way, but that enough moment is very variable. And Brazil is an interesting case to that respect, comparing to every other experience, because it is perhaps the longest episode we have had of hyperinflation. Then, of course, let's change a bit the hyperinflation definition for statistical purposes. That was done by Stanley Fischer in a classic study. I think it was 2002. He said, well, high inflation, or very high, is the one that starts when we hit 100% 12-month rolling, okay, accumulated. And then he said he had this IMF data set with the whole world in it, in which he said, well, we have something like, I don't know, it's about 20 or 30 cases in which we had an episode like that. And then he ordered these episodes, and it's what a surprise. Number one, in terms of duration plus average rate on during the episode, was Brazil. Number two, Argentina, right?
Yeah.
182 months of duration of the episode. And it was just one moment in which Brazil has gone over 50% per month. But see, it was like 15 years with average monthly inflation at something like 15-20% per month.
Yeah, I'll show a chart also later on. I'll show a chart here where you can see, for example, as an illustration, in 1989, you had 1,400%. In 1990, 3,000%. Then it went back to 433% in 91, but then it went back to 2,000%. And so it was year after year after year that it was just really high inflation. It's crazy.
It's crazy. And one thing we learn about this big inflation is that you have to uh, consider monthly rates every month. It's perhaps one of the definitions on one of the moments in which you know you are under a high inflation is that you don't look into yearly rates anymore. It's month by month. Okay, the moment you start looking into monthly inflations, that's when the process started to be really vicious. And then it was during on a Kagan definition basis, Brazil was under hyperinflation only for 4 months. But on the Stanley Fischer's definition, we've been there for like 15 years, right?
Wow. Yeah.
Uh, and and
And
uh,
you ended it, right? I mean, we're going to talk about it later, but you were the one of the architects of the Real Plan. We're going to discuss that, basically putting an end to this horrible period. Because tell me or describe to the viewer, how is it like to be living in those circumstances? For example, when you're 3,000% inflation, basically a beer goes from $1 or one real, whatever, to 30 the year after. So, first of all, how do merchants deal with this? How often do they change prices? Is it like every day or every month? Or
well, it's a nightmare, and we never cease to recover funny stories or strange stories about how it worked. And the experience of housewives in going to supermarkets was uh, huge in terms of how common people do sophisticated procedures to defend themselves from inflation. The common practice in those days, for instance, was for people, once they get their wage paid, you go right next to the supermarket because, inflation is about 1 or 2% per day. Okay. So if you don't go to do your monthly shopping and do a monthly shopping in order not to remain with any cash, right? Because cash is like uh, ice cubes, they're melting, right? So you do that. Then look at the supermarket. The supermarket, imagine a supermarket with like 3,000 items that an inflation is running at uh, 30, 40% per month. And you have to be able to sell everything and get money enough to buy everything back again, all right? That's your business. So you cannot make any mistake about the readjustment of the prices. But you have 3,000 items and you have like 3 or 4 people working with you with some system of changing the prices. And housewives are queuing in the supermarket just behind that guy changing the prices in order to be able to buy the stuff that he has not changed the price yet. It's like a daily war in which everybody plays against each other in order to be in front. Everything goes very fast, very. It's vicious. The atmosphere gets poisoned. I only living through that, I could understand the what people told the memory of Weimar and how uh, poison that had become, and how that could then produce social outcomes of
like Hitler?
yeah. Well, Germans
Because
would
it
say,
reminds me very much of what you like. The Weimar situation was also indeed the housewives waiting for their husbands to get back from work, already waiting at the factory gates to receive the money to buy stuff. Because also in Brazil, it was a cash economy, right? It was the early '90s, so there were no bank
yeah,
accounts weren't used then. I guess most people got their wages in cash also.
true, but also then the banking system or the ability of having a bank account would be an important divide. Part of society could defend themselves from inflation. Uh, even though they had to go to the bank almost every day to sort of protect. And banks would work also in a crazy way. They would buy government securities overnight to survive the next day. The next day they sell everything, and they have cash to kind of make available for people to do transactions. Public finances are just crazy in this environment, and banking operation was a nightmare. Everything was a nightmare.
Yeah. And because of the vicious situation, I guess there was also a lot of shortages of certain goods because it was so difficult to, as an entrepreneur, also to keep track of all the prices to make sure the margins were still okay. It also sometimes led to shortages of certain products in supermarkets, for example. Was that also the case?
Sure. Yes. If you make a mistake, you being a supermarket manager, you make a mistake in one product, the next month the producer has failed. It's all sorts of tragedies, and your supermarket, your shop could go bust from one week to the other if you make a mistake on prices. So families could be destroyed. Stories like that were there all the time. Someone has broken, failed, or made a mistake, sold everything, couldn't be able to buy it again, has a pile full of cash that were enough for a couple of months, and then it's over. The guy is so it's tragedies all around. Right.
And you say the people with bank accounts could protect themselves better. Was it also because they got an interest rate on their bank accounts, which of course was not sufficient, I guess, to keep up with inflation? But was that a way that people with bank accounts could protect themselves by getting some compensation in form of interest?
Yes, there's one thing that appears during the progression of the inflation process that seems to be not a answer, but I don't know, it helps. It's indexation. Indexation starts to be there all around in contracts, in and in bank accounts. You are sometimes capable of opening an account in the bank that in which there is this monetary correction feature. They pay you not interest, but they pay you inflation, last month's inflation. Okay, that seems to solve the problem. Banks then get your money and they buy from government a public security that also has the indexation feature, right? So the bank is defended, you are defended, you, the owner of a bank account like that. But that's a portion of the economy. You could never generalize indexation to everybody. Indexation is by essence some selective, and those protected navigate that process with less damage than the unprotected. So society becomes more unequal, more tense, more politically contentious, poisoned. Indexation was part of the process because there was like an anesthesia from the whole pain, but it's selective, just for a few.
Yeah, so would you say then that the burden of hyperinflation falls primarily on the shoulders of the poor and the vulnerable in society?
Absolutely, yeah. So it's very divisive, and of course, and it's interesting that it's not so visible in its political implications, so much that denying the whole thing is so dominant for so many years. At least that was the experience of my country. It took years for the political establishment to accept that the problem was inflation, and inflation wasn't the solution to economic development. And also, indexation did not solve the problem of inflation. It was not even good anesthesia for inflation because it was so selective, complex, sometimes. That was the moment in which there's some mobilization to really fight the disease. But in our case, we had such moments several times. And several times we mobilized, but we failed to fight the disease. The first more notable effort to fight inflation deployed basically a price freeze, which is a pretty intuitive way of fighting inflation, at least in the minds of politicians.
Yeah, but then you kill businesses, right? That's just a business destroyer.
But see, the simplicity of the concept, you pass legislation saying changing prices is illegal, or it's simple enough, right? So it doesn't work. But we tried 5 times. Starting 1986, the last one was 1991. 5 times. Only to learn that you can't end inflation with a price freeze. We also tried once an asset freeze thing that was pretty much like it was done in Europe after World War II in several countries, successfully, most notably in Germany. But see,
like capital controls, you mean?
No, asset freezes. You freeze bank accounts. You have a
Yeah.
and sort of normally a currency reform that divides the real value of the money stock by 2 or 3, and start all over again with a currency with a different name. It was done in several countries. It's traumatic, like nothing else in the field of monetary reform. Is not simply cutting zeros or nothing like that. And we've done it once, and it's okay to say that the president was impeached mostly because of that. President Collor. President Collor was the first president elected on a direct election after many years of military rule in Brazil. The guy, the election took place with inflation running at 50%. The guy took power when inflation was 82% per month. Then he brought a price freeze along with an asset freeze, and that was a disaster.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah. And did people also look for ways to protect themselves? I can imagine, for example, that you have a proliferation of dollars being used, or perhaps gold being accepted for bigger payments. Did you see during the heydays of these high inflation years that people would actively start using other currencies or something like that?
Well, other monies of account mostly. It was pretty much a feature of the Brazilian experience that we were pretty creative on indexation systems, or to have money of accounts that would serve the purpose of computing real values or values protected from inflation, independent of how payments were made, right? That was one feature of our experience. Little use of dollar accounts, and gold. Very little. And that is a bit of a contrast with our neighbors in Latin America, in which dollarization was very much the solution. It was pretty common, but not in our case. There is an interesting contrast between Brazil, say, and Argentina.
And why was that? Why did people not flee to the dollar then?
There are many. I don't know. Really. We normally describe this as sort of a home bias, which extends to the discussion of the capital account, of exporting wealth. The fact is that Brazilians have never fled their money away from the country like in other parts of Latin America. We kept financing the government with indexation and generous interest rates all through the process, then wealth has never led the country.
Very
And,
patriotic in that sense.
well, it's well remunerated, right?
Yeah,
It
yeah.
was a different social contract through which government pays your citizens, your wealthy citizens, uh, to carry government bonds, well paid, well remunerated, indexation plus interest, all that. So they don't go away with their capital because once they're gone, they're never back, right? Your country becomes kind of strange because the owners of everything has gone. Uh, mm, it's hard to describe, but when you get
Yeah.
into the inner workings of financial markets in Argentina and Brazil, you see that difference very clearly.
So most of the Brazilian debt was then in the 90s owed by Brazilians themselves, and there were in local currency owned by the Brazilians instead of what we see in Argentina often, of course, U.S. debt or debt held in dollars, and they had to have to default on it. But in Brazil, what you didn't have to default on your debt then, or could you say a bit more about the debt situation?
Yeah, that's exactly like you said. The government debt was mostly in local currency. It was held the by Brazilians. It was paid interest plus monetary correction, and it was never defaulted except for that traumatic experience in the 1990s, early 1990, with the asset freeze. That was perhaps one reason why it was so traumatic. We thought it could never happen. It did, but it was once, never, not anymore. Uh, it was a feature. Every hyperinflation is different. That's Tolstoy, right? You can be
Yeah.
unhappy in your own particular way.
Yeah, and that freeze also was accompanied then by a haircut. People, the assets were frozen, and then also because of the introduction of the new currency, people actually lost money. Like for example, that happened to my parents-in-law in Ecuador when they went from the sucre to the dollar in 2000. Then boom, 40% of their assets gone.
True, the trauma of the asset freeze, it was, of course, due to the haircut. The haircut was pretty sizable. It was in the form of a loan freeze. They seized your resources, your savings. It become like, well, frozen for like a couple of years, remunerated, but with low interest rates, just monetary correction, no interest.
Yeah.
So the sensation of a loss is not so much the interest rate difference, but the fact that the money is no longer available to you. That sensation was
Yeah,
horrible.
it's a nasty trick. And if what was the main driver then? Was it fiscally driven with large budget deficits, or was it more the central banks monetizing all the or most of the debt? Could you say a bit more about the main drivers of the Brazilian hyperinflation?
Well, it was that, of course. That was number one. Uh, the number two thing was capturing the central bank. That's the way to simplify, of course, a very complex story, but it was a combination of uh, fiscal irresponsibility with capturing the central bank. Uh, Ultimately, they're all alike to that respect, right? Uh, and fighting and winning over hyperinflation in Brazil was a matter of producing a positive fiscal result, uh, properly measured, primary surplus, mostly. Number one. And number two, to uncapture the central bank, to redefine money governance, essentially. And in Brazil, the one form that captured, assumed that was so uh, potent to generate hyperinflation was to place the central bank under orders of a political council, a council made of politicians that would order the central bank to, I don't know, to finance everything. To mostly the most favorite mechanism was to central bank to transfer monies within uh, the banking system uh, to the provincial banks and to the federal banks. And these banks would then conduct what we call the parafiscal deficit. They would then, well, they would, the, the expansion of their assets into producing hyperinflation. It looks a lot like what years later would be called quantitative easing, right? That's one of
Yeah,
the
exactly.
paradox. But that's, we've been practicing that for a while. There's lots of, at that time, each province in Brazil, states as we call them, had one or more commercial banks. 27 states. We had over 30 provincial banks, plus 5 federal banks. And it was like if each such bank would uh, work as a budget, was like the, the governors would use their banks as if it was their central banks, and each state was a country. Uh, and, it was just irresponsible. And the federal government would do the same 5 times over because it had 5 federal banks. And the central bank was the only institution responsible for that thing having any logic. But the National Monetary Council, on top of all that, had like the central bank had one vote over all this community of interests against against the currency, all pro economic development. That's how politicians think, and so it was an uncontrolled process, and it lasted years, and it was getting worse and worse slowly, right? And it up to the point that that big siren comes
Yeah,
and it's
and that's
enough
when
is.
you came in. So I was saying like some kids want to become a firefighter, but you eventually became a monetary firefighter because that's when you came in, and then it was 1994, right, when you started, and the year after it went down to 60 something percent, and then slowly but surely the inflation was eradicated. So what was your secret?
Well, the hero is Finance Minister Fernando Henrique Cardoso, uh, who uh, well, he was chosen to be finance minister in the middle of 1993, and he was minister for a year and a half, something like that, with the success of stabilization. He then ran for president and won in a space of like 1 year and a half. The guy was named finance minister. Nobody believed he could do anything different from the others were doing. He would then produce number six, the sixth attempt to fight inflation with a stabilization plan with currency reform. Number six, I remember people describing him as, it's a triumph of hope over experience. It's like Elizabeth Taylor marriage number 12. Chances of working are reduced, but it did work. Uh, it was like ready, and it was incredible how it was not perceived that it was just ready for the right thing to work. It was a window. Not that we have done something of a miracle. No, there's no miracle in that. There's a right moment. You do the right thing and it works. Uh, the right antibiotic, the right treatment, according to conventional medicine. There's no miracle, but there's a right timing for this to be applied. And it was the right time. I think we're lucky, or destiny was written that way. The fact was that applying the right vaccine, the right antibiotics, the fact was that in 1 year and a half, we have ended hyperinflation and elected the president with a agenda of reforms and change, modernizing the country. It was also, we're in the early 90s. It was it was the time of the fall of the wall and all those hopes with um, market-based reforms. And Brazil was not a communist country, but many of the reforms to be done in Brazil resembled those done in Eastern Europe. It was privatization, liberalization, market-based stuff, in addition to fiscal balance and reconstruction of market-based institutions. That was a lasting agenda that are still alive today and still doing stuff that started those years.
Because you were influenced by Jeffrey Sachs as well. I see in your bio that Jeffrey Sachs was one of your, I think when you wrote your thesis, he was your supervisor. I've had him on the show twice. He, of course, was responsible for many market reforms in I would say in Russia, or it didn't work out as well, but his methods did work out then in Brazil, or?
Well, he had no part on what happened to Brazil. He had some part, yes, definitely on my dissertation in Harvard. That he did, of course. And it was the time. It was 1985 when Jeff was first invited by the government of Bolivia to help them in negotiating with the IMF. Jeff was pretty young at that time, and I was doing my thesis under his supervision, and he said, "Look, it was a surprise to me. There's a hyperinflation in Bolivia. How about going there to work for me?" And I had to explain, look, I don't speak Spanish. It's a common mistake to think that Brazilians do speak Spanish, but we don't. We don't understand nothing. So better not. Choose somebody else. And that was enough of my experience, practical experience with Jeff, with hyperinflations. He had a career after that. He was successful in that Bolivia experience. And then this other experience in which he was very instrumental, to my knowledge, was in Poland,
Correct.
also
Yeah.
with success. But then I lost track. Had a marvelous career. I miss him. Send my regards to Jeff. But in the Brazilian case, he was not there. It was just too complex, too local.
Right.
There was a moment, interesting moment, in which some local investment bank called Thomas Sargent to write about the Brazilian case. And it was interesting that Sargent had written on the Brazilian case in 1986. By the time Brazil was doing the price freeze based stabilization unsuccessfully. And then Thomas Sargent wrote an open letter to the finance minister of Brazil, much like Keynes had written to Raymond Poincaré in France in 1926, if I'm not wrong, sort of counseling, giving advice to the French on what level of the exchange rate should they accept to go back to gold, right? See, but it's kind of a dangerous for foreign experts to make choices like that. Uh, Stabilization can be something pretty local, pretty complex. Sargent tried to repeat that stunt with Cardozo in 1984, saying, look, that thing you guys invented for the monetary reform in two stages, the interim virtual currency, this is nonsense. Remember the Mark in Germany, that was, unnecessary decoration to fundamentals and all that. And that was wrong, basically wrong, right? And the thing is, the virtual currency was very important for solving the problems created by indexation in the transition from high to low inflation. It was just so crucial to take away indexation, that is the wrong medication applied to inflation. Let's, let's not go in. Let's not go into the technicalities of it, but
No, I see it. That can become quite technical, but it worked for the Brazilians, so that's a good thing. Despite of
yeah,
what the sergeant guy said, but if you say like it is very fundamental for any nation, then to understand its own dynamics and to have the right currency and the right exchange rate. What then would you say about the euro? Because the euro is, of course, a very interesting setup as well, with different member states with different dynamics. They're all in a different place of their cycle. They have their own needs when it comes to the exchange rate, when it comes to interest rates. Would you say, with your experience and with your academic experience, all your research and your central bank experience, would you say it is a smart experiment to have a one size fits none currency, basically, in something as diverse as the eurozone?
well, how much time do we have for that? It's the one new thing I heard about the euro recently comes from Argentina. One of the explanations for proposed dollarization that they did not follow after all was that they would do something similar to what was done in Ecuador without a haircut. And it would be like much more like the euro than like the convertibility plan, Domingo Cavallo plan of the 90s. So the story goes like that. The next trick for a country like Argentina would be perhaps to do like Spain, that is, abstain from having a local currency, okay, and let's use as our currency, our legal tender, other currencies issued by, I don't know, in the case of Europe, it was a European Central Bank, but it could be just like the only legal need you have is to instruct your national treasury to to the extent of what currencies should people pay their taxes with, right? So it would be not much of a big problem if Argentina, Ecuador, uh, abolishes the national currency and then instruct the national treasury that now taxes can be paid in dollars or in euros or in Brazilian reais or in British pounds. It's okay. We accept everything, right? And there's even, you can speak of bitcoins and stuff like that, right? And that's it. It's done. You cease to have a national currency. You have lots of other things to solve for this to take place. You may have some need for well, there are lots of complexities, right? But I have never seen the selling of dollarization like that. And even the term dollarization is not truly applicable to that because it's not like like adopting the dollar in the ways we have done in this region of the country of the world in the past is There's no name for that yet, and but it was done in European countries. Can you imagine in Holland, France, Spain, Greece? They all ceased to have a national currency. That's pretty large for any country to do.
Yeah,
Uh,
you're giving up your sovereignty in a way. Huh? So
yeah, yeah. Well, sometimes, as in the case of Latin America, this has been justified. There were lots of consulting firms and people, professors, recommending this to be done in the context of selling currency boards as solutions for countries that have never learned to use their sovereignty to have orderly monetary systems. So then do something like a caixa de conversão, as we say in Portuguese, a currency board, which is sort of a 100% convertible machinery through which dollars become local currency, and that's it. But it didn't work. Okay, uh, uh, though it brought a interesting issue about sovereignty, right? If the price of sovereignty is hyperinflation, then people get you know kind of questions about that.
yeah, so maybe Mila is that desperate, or he understands that for some reason Argentinians looking back will never be able to properly run their own currency. So better to then just adopt another currency, even though you lose sovereignty, but at least it makes sure you don't have hyperinflation again. Would that be is that a valid reason to drop your own currency and adopt another one?
Yeah, well, Argentina has been exposed to ideas. Hey, they have implemented a currency board that lasted for a number of years. And while it was working, the sensation was good. Then it fell apart, and they're again under high inflation. And in the beginning of the Malay presidency, that seemed to be the dominant idea. They would do something like that, a new form of dollarization. Lacking a better name for that, they would do something like that. There was a book by Emilio Ocampo. It was by then the key advisor to the president, explaining the whole thing. We all read the book. It was well argued. But then, after the Milei's government started, they went a different way. They went pretty conventional. And in fact, they implemented a major fiscal shock that nobody thought they could succeed to the dimension they proposed, but it worked, and the effects of the fiscal shock were so great that they reverted the acceleration of inflation trend. It was running at, I don't know, like 200, 300% per year, on that range. And then now it's to the tune of 2, 3% per month.
Yeah, it's like 84 per year. I see now. Yeah, it came all the way from 300 to 84. So that's impressive. Too
Yeah.
bad he's pumping meme coins these days. That's a pity.
Well,
I mean, that was such a mistake, a blunder, right? I mean, he had a good track record, and then to pump a meme coin like that, where just a lot of people suffered from like huge amounts. I mean, that's just why? How? Do you understand that?
yeah, well, but it was a not a macro thing. It was a scam. Somebody's scam that involved the president, not something, not a policy thing.
No, true. It's not going to affect the economy to a large extent. It's just, I mean, it's just stupid as a president to lend your name and reputation to something like that.
Uh, but apart from that, the impression is very good on what's going on there. They abandoned, for the time being, those more creative alternatives and followed a pretty conventional path. Uh, it makes every sense. Whatever you would do, being creative with the currency, it would work depending on their ability to address the fiscal challenge. So why not starting with that instead of with the creative thing? The creative thing, the miracle solution, uh, may initially work and give you the sensation that miracles can happen, or that you have a, painless solution for a big problem, which is an illusion, of course. So they started with the big problem. Nobody believed they could have a fiscal surplus, and they did. uh, is it going to be sustainable? That is, they would maintain that for indefinitely, or is just something, like a price freeze, that it's temporary? That will depend. Uh, One thing I learned about fighting hyperinflation is that success generates conditions for more success. The more they stick around with that, the better it gets. They're much better now than in the beginning of government. Everything said about the impossibility of doing that, the political obstacles and all that, this is all toned down right now. There's some optimism about Millet, regardless of this is a difficult personality and not everybody likes
The
him. That's okay.
chainsaw, yeah. But
That's
does he
okay.
remind you a bit of not so much the person it's himself, but the area in which Argentina is right now? It's a bit like Brazil was then maybe in your era, where you guys were finally able to get rid of hyperinflation. So there's like similarities between where Argentina is right now and you guys were in '94.
Many similarities, but just so many. It's Brazil and Argentina have a very complex and rich relationship. One is counterfactual to the other, and one anticipates or the other in so many ways, but they're different. And I've been to Argentina a couple of months back, and it's different in important ways, but it's so similar. And I don't know. Well, now they are fighting with multiple exchange rates, which is something that we had to face in the past. In the case of Brazil, it was simpler. In 1994, we had, in 92, 93, we had like narrowed exchange rates to two of them, the official and the parallel market. They call it in Argentina the blue, but there's blue and there's several other colors. And we had in Brazil in the past like multiple exchange rates, and the unification and liberalization is a major part of the stabilization process, because it is a major part of your currency reform. And big inflation is a currency collapse, and you have to reconstruct the currency, and your currency has to have a dialogue with currencies of other countries, right? And that happens in the foreign exchange market. So the institutionality of the FX market is crucial. So you cannot have one official channel and the unofficial channel and a premium one of the other. That's nonsense. But that's the sort of the natural outcome when you have exchange controls. But the abolishment of exchange controls is not simple. We fought many years against that. It was a lot of work. I remember telling the folks in Argentina at Central Bank that we were lucky in Brazil in that process, because we had a gold discovery in the late 80s in Brazil, uh, that helped a lot.
With the
Uh,
reserve positions, of course. Yeah.
no, no, not with the reserves. It helped with the black market. I tell you what, the gold was discovered in some region in the north of Brazil, and it was mostly mined by scalpers, garimpeiros, as we call them. But then these folks would draw the gold from the soil, and then the central bank thought, let's get it right through Brazilian reserves. So they set up a buying station at the right next to the mine, with a law giving exclusivity to the Central Bank of Brazil to buy that gold. But then the mining guys would come with the gold and do the right math. They would the math was like the following: there's an international price for gold, but then I will sell my gold to the central bank uh, with the exchange rate of the black market. That's the true exchange rate, not the official rate. So if I take the international price of gold, convert it into local currency with the official rate, the central bank is robbing me. So they don't sell. What happened? They didn't sell the gold to the central bank. The gold didn't go to the reserves. And all of a sudden, Uruguay has become a major exporter of gold, not being a producer. That's interesting,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, then the central bank had to do something, then it was forced into sort of liberalizing the foreign exchange market, to make a long story short, uh, to be able to buy this gold paying market rates. Then the scalpers would sell the gold to the central bank. The gold would then go into the black market as a supply shock. The black market then started to show a negative premium with respect to the official market, and that was the way to the complexity of unifying markets of foreign exchange. One very important step to stabilization and the reconstruction of the currency. Argentina is facing this right now, but see, they have the blue, they have a number of other
50 Shades of Grey, yeah. But it's
types of.
interesting that the gold played an indirect role in Brazil's recovery. I also noticed that Brazil has very little gold at the moment, like 120 something tons, or if I'm not mistaken, 129 tons, which is nothing, of course. Like Holland, we have 600 plus, but it doubled its holdings in 21 from 67 to more than 120. So, what do you think of that? Do you think because a lot of central banks across the world are buying up gold, also BRICS nations a lot actually, Russia, India, China. Do you think the Central Bank of Brazil perhaps holds more than they are willing to disclose, and should they ramp up their buying efforts as well?
Well, Paul, I didn't know. I really don't know. I remember from my days that we had reserves in gold, but I was always lending this gold to have some return on those reserves, and the rates were miserable. So I always my idea was to get rid of that. But it wasn't the good moment. So we kept it. I don't know where we stand on this right now, but Brazil produces gold, and there's a all this mechanic of acquisition of locally produced gold by the central bank still there, to my knowledge. It was never important for us as a reserve asset, really.
Do you understand why the current generation of central bankers, especially in upcoming nations, are interested in buying so much gold? Do you see the logic of that?
Um, well, I have to stretch my imagination, but I would start searching something related to crypto crypto was the big phenomenon, perhaps, to affect the demand for gold as an asset. But I know nothing about gold. You're the expert. I'm not risking giving you any hints on that.
Well, it's interesting because I like gold, but I'm not a central banker, so I would like to understand why central bankers. Of course, most of the times when they're asked in surveys, they say because we distrust the dollar, especially after what happened early 22 when the war escalated in Ukraine and Russian assets were frozen. That's, according to a lot of central bankers, the main reason why they are sort of ditching the dollar and buying up gold. Would that make sense in your view?
Well, in the Brazilian context, there was a time gold was a a a defense from high inflation, uh, alongside with the black market for dollars. It was a distressed asset. So um, in TV news, prime time, you would always hear today gold prices reached a peak because the president said such and such, and inflation is running wild. So there was a value in having a distressed asset that sort of tells you when things are going wrong. In Brazil, that was the black market for dollars and gold for a while. Then, when the FX liberalization proceeded, the gold market was absorbed into the mainstream FX market and the derivatives market for gold and other commodities. But I see huge value in having a distressed asset. Saying that the price of gold has risen because of a war, it's a sort of a confirmation that war is a bad thing. We don't need much confirmation for that, but that's other
Yeah.
events that produce a rise in the price of gold are like war, bad things, and
Yeah.
it's a good warning sign. Uh,
It's a
Bitcoins,
sentiment
perhaps.
index. Yeah, it's basically like, of course, a canary in the coal mine, or it's a thermometer. It's something that's expresses sentiment in society, and if it's going up, it's usually not a good thing.
Yeah, and it's pretty European also.
Yeah. About Europe, you haven't answered my question yet. Whether you, from an economic point of view, you think the euro is a good or a bad experiment?
Well, um, see, I live in a big country like Europe, and back here, we sometimes think of was it good to remain united as a big continental country, or have should we have allowed uh, aspirations of some Brazilian states to become countries uh, to to progress. I remember I have a professor back in school that had this theory about uh, the world would be a better place if we did not have any country with more than 5 million inhabitants, only small countries. Okay, there would be no military superpower, no wars, no. I'm not sure about that theory, but there's a point there. A world of big or small countries. We are a big country, and there's a discussion here that the other day I saw you discussing with you the euro. There's something here similar, and this theory in Brazil goes on like that. Brazil is commonly described as a country that is a combination of several countries. And the most famous description is that Brazil is like Belinja. It's a combination of Belgium and India. It's a one small rich country somewhere in the middle of a big India, right? That's one description. The other more it highlights inequality in that to that respect. The other more contemporaneous description is that there's Brazil north and south. Uh, take not the equator, but sometime some place between the equator and the Tropic of Capricorn. Draw a line. The south of Brazil would be something a lot like uh, Australia, or think of a combination of Australia and Argentina. And the north is a lot about Venezuela without oil. Okay,
Oh, that doesn't sound good.
but if you divide, and population is more or less proportionally distributed in these two halves of the country. But if you all of a sudden separated that Brazil in these two regions, the question would be how the exchange rate would be in these two countries, right? Most likely the South would be a strong currency country and the North would be a weak currency country. If the North has a staple export, okay, they would survive and progress. But the South is more conventionally the developed part of the country. And then the discussion of it's better to be separate or together, right? I don't have an answer for that, but that's a big question, interesting discussion, which in our case goes into regional differences discussion or priorities to be given to one region in detriment to the other, the budget, the subsidy discussion, and all that. And I don't have an answer for that.
No, but it's fair to say that at least in Brazil, there's one language, one anthem, one soccer team, very important, of course, and much more of a. In Europe, we don't have those things. We have the European Eurovision Song Festival, which is complete. I don't even know how to describe how much I don't like that event, but it's so in Europe we lack this. I mean, we're being forced into trying to become one people, but we lack even one language, which I think it's crucial for people to understand each other. And we are, of course, we can talk English, and of course in Europe there's many people that also speak English, but it's not our native language. Anyway, I always find it interesting to ask this question to people that live outside of Europe to have a fresh perspective on things. Final question to you, Gustavo, because I know I've been holding you up for much longer than I anticipated. People like Elon Musk and Trump, they worry about the debt finances of the US. Do you think it's foreseeable that the US, if they don't do anything about their debt situation, their deficits, that they could also enter a path of high or hyperinflation with all the knowledge you have about the phenomenon?
Well, not really. That thing about the exorbitant privilege is exists for a reason. It may be that they sort of abuse or of this privilege, but see, Europeans have been telling the Americans about this for a while. But truly, no, they're not good central economy like Britain was in the 19th century. I think it's no good when the sort of more important economy, the central economy, opts into becoming isolationist, right? And it's no good. But then there's China aspiring to be the one central economy the US doesn't want to be. The relations between these two nations in terms of indebtedness are huge. Uh, uh, it's very complex, right? Uh, and the point you raised has to do with how the budget works in a country with an exorbitant privilege, in which apparently they can issue debt with no limit because either China or the rest of us will all hold international reserves, not in gold but in claims against the U.S. Treasury, AAA claims. Well, there might be limits. There's some fatigue with respect to that. As I see in your questions about the euro, a fatigue with respect to the euro, which might have been implemented with very good intentions, with some good results, but something new is required now for different moment. The U.S. has had its fatigue problems, and unfortunately, the response is Donald Trump. I don't know where that goes. It's pretty controversial, right? And improvisation, a lot of improvisation combined with a lot of improvisability, right? I don't know where it goes.
Yeah, well, we'll see. Interesting times ahead of us. Such a. I would love to pick your brains for hours, but I'm glad we had this conversation. Anything else you would like to say at the end here?
No, Paul, it's been enough. We have risked a lot in a number of issues.
Yeah, and people can find more about you. You have, of course, an active X profile. I'll put it in the show notes so people can follow you on X. I also put the name of your company. Yeah, that you have an investment company as well, Rio Investment, if I'm not mistaken.
Rio Bravo.
Yeah, Rio Bravo, exactly. Named after the river, right?
Well, that's how the people from the south call the frontier between us, the South, and the U.S. It's also a very good Western movie.
Yeah.
But Rio Bravo is an investment company that does real estate investment trusts in the Brazilian version, and it's an investment house. So that's what I am to these days. I'm a businessman.
Yeah, you're a businessman. Central banker turned businessman. Great. Love talking to you, Gustavo. Thanks so much for your time. Send my regards to your lovely wife, and let's stay in touch.
Thank you, Paul. See you next year in Warwick again.
Will be nice.